Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the 63rd Learn with Lorna. This week we're looking at stories hidden in the landscape. If this is your first time joining us, my name's Lorna Steele and I'm the Community Engagement Officer for the Highland Archive Service. And this is Learn with Lorna, which was initially set up for homeschooling but has become much broader and much more wide-ranging as a series to introduce the collections of the Highland Archive Service to people both in the Highlands and further afield. The Highland Archive Service has 4 archive centres spread across the Highlands of Scotland. We have one in Inverness, the Highland Archive Centre. We have one in Wick, Nucleus, the Nuclear and Caithness Archives. One in Portree, the Skye and Lochailsh Archive Centre. And one in Fort William, the Lochaber Archive Centre. Before I go into this week's talk, a reminder that this series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer, that High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and that there's no payment or subscription required to take part in the Learn with Lorna series. A reminder though, if you are able to do so, that any donations you make towards us, although there's no payment or subscription required to take part in this, any donations you are able to make towards the service are so much appreciated. And I know I say it every week, but really I do mean it. Both means a lot to both myself and the rest of the team, so thank you for that. I've added a new series of events up until the end of September. So the next series of Learn with Lorna talks right up to the end of September are now scheduled. So if you want to join us for any of those or have a look and see what's coming up, then please go onto any of our 4 Facebook pages. This gets broadcast across all 4 centres' Facebook pages. So please do have a look at any of those. Go into the events tab and then register that you're interested or that you're going to attend, and that way you'll be absolutely sure of getting a reminder. And please, as I've asked before, please do share these talks to anyone you think might be interested. As I've spoken about before, Facebook sometimes has changeable algorithms. That means that we don't always reach the people that we have done previously. So if you could share these talks, I would be very grateful. And welcome if you're new watchers. I'm seeing some new names coming in. I know I've spoken at a few webinars in the last couple of weeks of training sessions for people in archives and heritage sector. So if you're new from those, then welcome, and I'm sure everybody will say hello to you. So this week we are moving on to carrying on to look at our theme of landscape and environment, and the idea of stories hidden in the landscape. It's a really interesting theme as I was kind of putting things together and noting ideas down, because of course our landscape is so intertwined with the lives and the stories of the people who have lived here, who've worked here, who've holidayed here. The landscape is so intertwined with that, and as we talked about when we looked at the Field Club, that notion of the physical landscape of a country being tied in with the character and personality of its people is really relevant. So we've looked over the past weeks and months at so many subjects that are tied into this. So for instance, armies marching across the moors, or planes crashing in the mountains, or children walking to school, farmers and drovers working on the land, and the construction of substantial buildings like churches or factories, railways, canals, all of those sorts of things are hugely tied in with the physical landscape. And all of those things have to some extent left their mark in the landscape. Things like buildings and factories, the canal, things like that obviously leave a very long legacy. They're very visible. Other events have just left a trace in the landscape to show of something that might have come before. And although there may be little or nothing left, they often remain in our artwork, in our documents, oral traditions, and in the collective memory of a country. And the Highlands is full of things like this. So, for instance, if you think of that kind of classic image of the ruined shieling or a cleared village, you can see that those what look like empty spaces have been thriving communities before the clearances and other events and emigration took people away. Things like brochs in Caithness that show a link back to a time long ago. And things like cairns and memorials and cairns on the top of hills, things like that, that show a mark of something that's happened. And one of the main ways we can start to look and uncover some of these stories, and one of the main places to look is at maps. And as I always say, I know there will be map fans because there are always map fans. So I'm going to start by looking at some maps. Okay, so there's several ways that we can use maps to find indicators of things that have happened in the landscape. The first thing is place names. The second, I would say, is showing of a place where events took place. So that showing marking a place where something happened, or where something is believed to have happened, or rumoured to have happened, or where legend says something happened. And also maps show the location of things like tombs, ruins, monuments, things that have been excavated or dug up. And those things will point us in the direction of further research. So we're going to look at a couple of examples. So first of all, place names. A really great example of this is the many place names which have the word done in their names. And this is, I'm sure, certainly New Zealand will have Dunedin. There will be other examples. Dun comes from the Irish or the Scottish. It comes from both types of Gaelic words, and it means fort. And so there are dozens of places, both across Scotland and across the wider UK and Ireland, that contain either are called Dun or contain the word Dun in their name. So, for example, Dumbarton, Dundee, Dunfermline, Donegal in Ireland, all of these have come from the word fort. And so when you look at some of these places in the Highlands, you can look at the place name in the map and then go to the accompanying Ordnance Survey namebook, which I know I've spoken about before. The first edition Ordnance Survey maps in the 1840s, 50s were accompanied by namebooks which give more information about the things marked on the map. And so, for example, an example of this is Duntaive in Brachadale in Skye. And the example that I'd like to read you for that one is from the Ordnance Survey namebook, and that says, "This is the remains of a supposed ancient fort. It is situated on an eminence adjacent to the above-named hill, Bendu, the Black Hill. There is merely a trace now of what seems to have been a circular wall remaining, and a quantity of loose stones. The name of this signifies Fort of Peace or Rest," which is an interesting one. Duncreech is one of the many examples in Sutherland in the parish of Creech, and the Ordnance Survey namebook reference for that refers to both the fort and a subsequent castle, which is now also in ruins at the time of writing. And so for the fort, it says, "Duncreech, the name applies to the remains of a vitrified fort situated on the summit of the above hill. The following is an extract from the new statistical account for the parish of Creech on this subject. On the summit of the dune or hill of Creech, there is a specimen of those very puzzling relics of antiquity, the vitrified forts. It is considered by persons conversant with these appearances as a good specimen, and has been visited by Sir George Mackenzie and others." And then the next entry down, which talks about the subsequent the subsequent building on the site, says, Duncreech again, "This applies to the remains of an ancient castle situated on the summit of the hill of Creech and within the boundaries of the vitrified fort described above. It says it was built in the 14th century on the site of the early vitrified fort by Paul MacTire, grandson of a Norse prince and the Rob Roy of the North, who married the daughter of the House of Balnagowan." So those really give up, I don't know please tell me if you agree with me, but to me, those kind of entries really conjure up images of the Norse princes and the forts and the people. Why was it called the Fort of Rest or Peace? Was it just a resting place en route to somewhere else? There's so many stories in there, and the majority of them we will never know a huge amount more about. Another good example is the story of Dunskrieben, which is an early Bronze Age to Pictish Age fort, so somewhere around 2400 BC to 900 AD. So some of that obviously before many written records. But it's referred to in the Ordnance Survey namebook for the parish of Boleskine and Abertarf. And it reads like this. "On the brow of the hill fronting Loch Ness and near the hamlet of Bunloit, there is a small vitrified fort called Dunskrieben, which communicated with similar signal stations at the east end and centre of the Great Caledonian Valley. And about 2 miles west of the castle in Glenurquhart rises a very prominent rocky hill, styled Craigmony, which was partly encircled on the summit with rude walls of stone, and on which tradition says the ancient beacon fires were lighted, besides it being used as the Gallows Hill of the old castle. In Argyllshire, a tradition prevails that a Danish or Norwegian prince of the name of Moni, having landed in the district of Crinan, still known as the Pass of Moni, and laid waste to the country, was afterwards attacked by the native inhabitants, who routed his troops and pursued him and a few of his followers, who with difficulty regained their ships and fled northward towards Lochaber. Having reached Craigmony and established himself in the adjoining valley still called Dalmony, the son of this king of Lochlin or Norway, as he is styled in the country, seems afterwards to have been driven further up into the country and to have perished at Corrimony, the valley of Mony, where his grave is still to be seen. So as I say, you immediately thrown into this picture of a past that it's quite hard for us to connect to sometimes, but when we walk in our landscape and in the landscapes of many different countries, and I'm seeing there a new viewer in Pakistan, and it will be the same in every country, that there will be so many stories of a long, long history as you stand in a landscape. Some of them we'll know about, some of them we will never know about. Now, you may have heard within that text that they mentioned that site of that fort was also the Gallows Hill, the Gallows area. And I've spoken before about the number of places that have the word gallows in their title. So Gallows Tree, Gallows Hill, there's a lot of those. Some of them are a little different. So for instance, Skye has several, including Bialachnacroich, which is the pass of the gallows, and Drumnacroich, which is the ridge of the gallows. But there are many, many of them. An example from Sutherland is Knocknacroich, the hill of the gallows. And the entry for that reads, "A small hill at Betty Hill, on which a gallows was formerly erected, and upon which some persons were executed and hanged." And again, there are stories there, some of which we'll know through our court records, through estate records maybe, but many of those we won't know. We won't know a huge amount about those stories, but what remains on our maps and in our name books and in the statistical accounts is a connection, a reference to those stories. And of course, some of those names disappear. So some survive, like Gallows Hill, but some disappear through time. So for instance, in Inverness, Rose Street was previously known as now I might get this wrong, as you know, I'm not a Gaelic speaker, Stradanacroich, which was the street of the gallows. And that was because it was the route that the condemned criminals were led from the jail down to the Longman, which at that point was the place of execution. And even the Longman itself, the name has various potential origins, and one of which is the fact that maybe it was called the Long Man because of the shadow of someone hanging there. In Castle Street is another example, which used to be called Doomsdale, and for the same reason, that progress from the prison to the gallows. And so again, those stories, and I've touched on them on previous weeks through punishment, crime and punishment weeks and things like that, of the people being whipped through the streets and being punished and disciplined. And some of those stories we'll know, and again, some of them we never will. Maps also reveal the sites or possible sites of events long in the past. So not just those regular occurrences like the executions, but one-off events in the past or potential sites of things in the past. So for instance, battles. There are dozens of sites of battles, hundreds probably, marked on the Ordnance Survey name books. And some of them are very obvious and we know a huge amount about them. So for instance, obviously Culloden, Glenshiel are recorded on the maps and in many other documents. And some of them are further in the past but still known about, like the Battle of Alderne. And some are much earlier battles about which very little, if anything, is known. Maybe the names of the sides that took part, maybe not even that. But we'll start with the Battle of Alderne. So the Battle of Alderne was one of the battles that was fought as part of the Covenanting Wars. I'm very conscious that I don't have a huge amount of time to go into the detail of how any war comes about. But in one sentence, the Covenanting Wars were a series of religious and political conflicts initially about church doctrine and structure. And they were fought between the Covenanting army and the Royalist armies. And so the Battle of Alderne, which was fought in May 1645, was fought between the Marquess of Montrose's Royalist army on behalf of Charles I and the Covenanter army under Sir John Hurry. It's a notable battle for several reasons. One is because it was a substantial and important victory for the Scottish Royalists, but the other one, which has only come subsequently to be known as why it's important to be realised, is that it was one of the last battles in Europe where bows were used, and it's been proved that bows were used quite extensively at that battle, but not been proved that they've been used anywhere since. So quite interesting. But I wanted to read to you the entry from the first statistical account for the parish of Alderne, which describes the battle. The Battle of Alderne. The ground to the south and west of the village, which sits just near Nairn, for those who don't know, was the scene of one of the victories of the celebrated Marquis of Montrose. Having defeated the Campbells at Inverlochy, he marched into Murray, whence a detachment of the Covenanting army, commanded by Hurry, not being in condition to oppose him, retired to Inverness. They were immediately reinforced by the Frasers, Mackenzies, Rosses, Sutherlands and Brodies, and their number thus amounted to about 3,500 foot and 400 horse. Montrose, having also received reinforcements, from which his army amounted to about the same number, proceeded to Alderne and waited for the approach of the Covenanters. These, advancing from Inverness, engaged the Royalist army on the 9th of May 1645. The latter seemed to have occupied very nearly the line of the present road between Newmill and Alderne, their right wing being posted on the site of the modern village, and their left rested on the bog of Newmill. Previous to the engagement, Montrose ascended the steeple of the church which stood on the rising ground above the village, the view from which position commanded the approach of the enemy and the whole field of battle. Here he seems to have remained a spectator of the fight until circumstances about to be mentioned called him to the aid of his men. The attack commenced on the part of the Covenanters, and was directed against the left wing of the Royalists, commanded by a Highlander named MacDonald, and entrusted by Montrose with the charge of the royal standard. The troops under MacDonald, though well defended by brushwood and enclosures, soon gave way before the veterans of the Covenant. When Montrose observed this, he descended from the steeple, and advanced with Lord Gordon to attack the left wing of the Covenanters. These, after a very obstinate resistance, he put to flight, and advancing to the aid of MacDonald, succeeded at length in defeating the whole of the army's force. His success on this occasion was considerably aided by an unskilful movement on the part of Major Drummond, who commanded Hurry's horse. This officer, anxious to support the infantry when hard pressed by Montrose and Lord Gordon, wheeled about so suddenly that he encumbered the ranks of the foot and threw them into partial disorder, which ended in their ultimate defeat. For this he is said to have been tried at Inverness and condemned to be shot. Various accounts are given of the number slain on both sides, and the most correct seems to be that of Shaw, who says that 800 of the Covenanters and a considerable number of the Royalists fell in this battle. Among those killed on Montrose's side was Macpherson of Invereshie. If tradition may be credited, the life of MacDonald, though he was brave to desperation, was saved as much by his cunning as by his bravery. He was engaged hand to hand with Hay of Canudi, a tall and powerful man, and perceiving himself to be overpowered, he called out to Hay, "I'll not deceive you, my men are coming behind you." Having by this means induced Hay to turn round, he saved his own life by stabbing his adversary. It goes on to say that next to the battle site there is now a small clump of trees enclosed with a dyke, and here lie many of those slain in the Battle of Alderne. And that then and since is known as Deadwood. And it's one of those sites that something really momentous happened there. Hundreds of lives were affected, hundreds of lives were lost. And now, if you didn't know, you would walk on that site and maybe not realise. And it's the same with so many of these sites. I'm going to pause for a second to remind you that this series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer, that High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and that there's no payment or subscription required to take part in the Learn with Lorna series. Now, as I mentioned, there are also references to battles which are much less known. So, for instance, in Kilmallie, there's a place on the map marked as Tom na Bratach, and the entry for that just reads, "This knoll commands an extensive view to the east and west, and tradition says that a battle was fought about this place." And there are many, many like that, and I do hope, if you're interested, that you go and have a look at the statistical accounts or at the Ordnance Survey name books. If you go into the search on Scotland's places and just type in fort or battle or any of these, you'll find so many references to battles about which there's very, very little known, but nevertheless those stories lie hidden in the landscape, and those lives that were affected by those events. Now, some places still have a visible reminder of what took place there, a cairn, a plaque, a marker, something like that. And for instance, one example of this is the stone which marks the site of the Battle of Ultimarlach, which was fought between the Sinclairs of Keith and the Campbells of Glenorchy on the 13th of July 1680, so round about the same period that we were just talking about. I will read here. My lovely colleague Jennifer in Nucleus wrote some background of the battle, and rather than interpret it into my own words, I'm going to read the notes that Jennifer very kindly sent to me, and we'll talk about the Battle of Ultimarlach. The battle came about when George Sinclair, the 6th Earl of Caithness, had to sell his property and title to Sir John Campbell of Glenorchy due to his great debt, and Campbell being one of his primary creditors. After George Sinclair died, John Campbell became the next Earl of Caithness and took possession of the Sinclair estates. However, George Sinclair of Keith disputed this, especially the transfer of the lands of Northfield and Tister, which he would have inherited from his father. The matter was put before the Privy Council of Scotland, who ruled in favour of Campbell of Glenorchy. Not being content with this, George Sinclair kept the lands and made it very difficult for Campbell's men to collect the rents. Nearly all the gentlemen in Caithness supported Sinclair of Keith in his cause, his two staunchest supporters being David Sinclair of Broynach and William Sinclair of Thura. I'm seeing a connection there in the supporters, who also assisted him in demolishing the castle of Thurso East, which Campbell had taken possession of. At length, an act was passed by the Privy Council, charging hail, kin, friend and followers of John Earl of Caithness to concur and assist in recovering the disputed lands. John Campbell of Glenorchy took around 800 men into Caithness to complete this task. George Sinclair of Keith had around 500 men waiting for them near Wick. The Sinclairs, having had a good fill of drink the night before in Wick, were in no state to fight and thus lost the battle. And it was said that so many were killed that the Campbells were able to cross the river without getting their feet wet. George Sinclair and his main supporters were able to escape on horseback. In 1681, Sinclair's lands were restored to him, along with the title Earl of Caithness, and John Campbell of Glenorchy was granted the title Earl of Breadalbane in compensation. And again, there's little remaining of that site, hardly anything, apart from a cross that stands alone that was put up on the site in 1901 to mark the event that had taken place there. And it's just extraordinary, and I hope that you're feeling that too, just extraordinary when you look at these huge events involving hundreds or dozens of people, and there's now very little mark left in the landscape. But if you were to walk now by that river, or but on the sites that we've talked about, then you think something very momentous happened here. Sometimes there is something left in the landscape which indicates past, but we don't know what it is. So there's a stone or a marker that shows something has taken place here, but little is known about it. And so, for instance, there are many stones and stone circles across the whole country, but across the Highlands, which we know something about, but not a huge amount about. And a great example of that is the Cabbage Stone in the parish of Nairn. This is a very long extract, so I'm not going to read it all to you. But I want to give you the three possible stories there are for this stone. Okay, so basically this is a rough standing stone of grey sandstone, around about 6 feet, about 4 feet wide. It stands, as I say, in the parish of Nairn, and it has shapes inscribed on it. So I'm sure you'll all be familiar with the wonderful Pictish stones we have up here with the engravings and drawings drawn on them. And the Cabbage Stone has some markings, a circle, and some other markings on it, but there's really little known about it. And so when they wrote the Ordnance Survey name book in the mid-1800s, these are the three possibilities they gave for what this stone means. Various are the local traditions regarding the origin of this stone. First, that the Danes used it as a mooring post for their invading galleys. The only fact in favour of this tradition is the close proximity of the old beach line of the Murray Firth, but so far as is known to the examiner, this tradition has no support in written records. 2. That a thief having stolen a cheese, date ancient but unknown, stolen a cheese from Inverness Market, was here overtaken, slain and buried, and this is his monumental stone with the effigy of his crime, the kebbuck, a cheese, scratched upon it. And it talks about the fact that there is some precedence for this. There's some documentary evidence for this. And it says, where this, so they're referring back to an earlier gazetteer, where this parish, i.e. Ardasir, is divided from Nairnshire, there is a stone of about 6 feet high and 4 foot broad called the Cabbage Stone, which tradition says was erected over a man who fell in an affray in the town of Inverness. So that's one possibility. So it's either a mooring post for the Vikings, or it's a monument to a man who stole a cheese. Please let me know if you live anywhere near another monument to a man that stole a cheese, because I would love to make a collection of those. And the third one is, a local tradition makes this a covenant stone. George Cuthbert read about 20 years ago in an old gazetteer of Scotland, and Peter Mackenzie read recently in a small book that he's now managed to lose, as follows. In ancient times, a burn round by the Slack to the west of the Quebec Stone. This stream formed the boundary between the lairds of Delnies and Ardasir, but rainy seasons at times changed its course, which gave rise to bickerings as to the exact boundary, ending often in feud and bloodshed. On one day, the antagonistic lairds had mustered their tenants for battle when a third laird from the West Highlands, named Cameron, attended by a large following appearing on the scene, demanded to be made the mediator and settle the dispute, whereupon ensued peace, sealed by a feast of bread, cheese and whisky, and crowned at its close by the heretofore antagonistic tenantry, raising this stone as a token of perpetual peace between their feudal lords. And they say that they think the marks on the stone, again, are to represent the cheese that was served at the feast. And it says, to testify the liberality of Ardasir insofar as cheese is concerned. And what's interesting is there is still a cheese pantry in Ardasir, so they are still liberal with cheese here. Within our collections, we also have documents which refer to events which are not entirely forgotten, but are not entirely apparent when you visit. So, for instance, the court records. There is one document in our court collections that talks about, it's from 1721, it's the warrant of imprisonment for John McKeon, alias Rory, of Lochalsh, charged with the murder of troops at Lochaffric. I know nothing more about this. I can find no other reference to what happened there. If anyone else knows, please let me know. If anyone wants to go away and research, because I know that sometimes happens and then people contact me afterwards, then please do. 1721, John McKeon for the murder of troops at Lochaffric. But what I do know is when you go to Lochaffric now, if I didn't know that document existed in our collections, I would have no idea that that had happened on that site. Another part of Highland history, well known to those in and around, but not to people out with perhaps, is the Sutherland Gold Rush. So the connection between Kildonnan and Helmsdale and gold started in about 1818, when a lump of gold weighing 10 pennyweights was found in the River Helmsdale. And of course there was immediate interest, local and national. But it was really not until 50 years later, in 1868, when this really came to prominence. So further nuggets were found by a man called Robert Gilchrist, a local man, and he had recently returned to Sutherland after spending nearly 20 years in the goldfields of Australia. And so, of course, he knew what he was looking for in the landscape and how to look. And the Duke of Sutherland gave him permission to pan for gold in the River Helmsdale. And gradually, that news spread of the permission being granted. And within 6 months, over 600 people had arrived in Kildonnan, in Helmsdale, to pan for gold. And this resulted in the construction of a small town, which was named Ballinor, which is the gold village or the gold town. And the Duke of Sutherland started to charge £1 per month for licences to prospect for gold. And we have a range of documents in our collections relating to this. And we hold, for an example of one of the licences. We also hold the police occurrence books, which talk about the police having to visit and patrol Ballinaur in addition to their other sites they were patrolling, and also to report thefts of gold that had taken place. Gradually, as a result of the increase in the licence fee, there's an inside British joke for you. As a result of the increase in the licence fee and the reduction of funds, the reduction in number of fines, gradually the numbers dropped, and the Duke of Sutherland eventually stopped the panning for gold in January 1871. And if you're interested in finding out about this part of Sutherland's history, then I would encourage you to visit Timespan, which is a local museum, so either in person or have a look at their website for more information about that extraordinary bit of Sutherland's history of gold panning, which you would think would be incredibly well known, and it's not as well known as it maybe should be. And then, of course, there are loads of stories hidden in our landscape that have come from the much more recent past, but for various reasons have been lost or covered up. And I'm going to finish by looking at a couple of these from Caithness. It's quite hard to imagine now, if you've been to Latheron Wheel in Caithness, that between March and October 1928 there was a machine gun range right in the village. And the sight of red warning flags and guards posting around in the sound of gunfire was completely normal for daily life in Latheron Wheel. Roads and footpaths were closed to people passing, and you weren't allowed to cross the site if there was anything happening. And there were only certain exemptions to this. So HM warships were allowed to pass, military aircraft, and vessels which were tending to buoys at sea were allowed to pass. And Nucleus, our Nuclear and Caithness archives, hold plans of this machine gun range and also copies of the relevant bylaws that talk about detailing the operation of the machine gun range, what happened there and how it happened. But as I say, 1928, that's so very recent compared to some of the things we've been talking about. We started with vitrified forts in 2400 BC. 1928, I may be incorrect, but I would imagine there are people living around the area who are not aware of that machine gun range. And then, of course, during the wars, so in World War I, Thurso very briefly had a seaplane station. It was there before it moved to Scapa Flow. And then by World War II, Caithness had 5 airfields, emergency landing areas, decoy airfields and bunkers. And some of those buildings remain, some of them still sit in the landscape, but it's hard, I think, for us to imagine the scale and the movement of people. And I know when I've talked previously about both the First and Second World War, I don't know if I have referred to this precise document before, but we hold documents that talk about the increase in rail transport and the huge increase in transportation of timber, of troops, movement of people, evacuees. And I think it's very easy for us to forget that huge change that took place in the landscape. Similar to Lochaber, when we talked about in Aluminium Week about the decoy aluminium factory that was set up. It was set up to serve an urgent and very important purpose and then dismantled. So some of those things have been dismantled, some of them have been abandoned, some of them have gradually faded into the landscape. And if there's anything like that near you, then do comment and do let us know. I'm going to stop there. I haven't even touched on so many other things. So there are sites of excavation, there are entries on the maps that record items being dug up, so whether that's Bronze Age material or skulls, all sorts of different things that are sometimes referred to on the maps. Ancient ruins of priories and other religious buildings, tumuli and tombs, about which we know very, very little, but each of those represents a story of a person who has dwelt and lived in this landscape. And caves, hiding places that people have hidden on their way to escape. So we'll maybe come back another time and look some more at some of the stories that have happened in our landscape, but for which there's now not much evidence. The one thing I took out of this as I was writing it, and I'd be interested to see what you think, but is that we live in this landscape now. We have no more ownership of it than the people who came before, and it's just so interesting for us to know that we live so much in the moment, but we are always walking in the footsteps of the people that came before us. I will stop talking now. Thank you for joining me. I really hope you have enjoyed hearing some of the stories that are hidden in our landscape. If you can join me next week, I'll be looking at Caithness harbours. I know there's quite a few people who are interested in that and who have an interest in the harbours of the North Coast. So I hope you can join me for that. Again, please go onto our Facebook page, go into the events tab and register your interest in attending if you would like to do so. A reminder that this series is brought to you by High Life Island at no cost to the viewer, that High Life Island is a charity registered in Scotland, and that there's no payment or subscription required to take part in these events, but if you're able to donate towards our work, then we very much appreciate that. And thank you for all your comments. I love seeing them coming in as I'm talking. It's really nice. And I'll chat to you again next week. Thank you.